What's that?
Section 5 wasn't on last week's quiz.
Yes, and so what does that say about the rest of the quiz?
Pretty
It's
similar.
identical.
It was identical. So I thought, that'll be nice for you to go through here and. Sorry, I'm just looking for my own sheets. Here we go. And so you can perfect your answer from last time. So things that are discussed in numbers. So our Sunday school class here, as we're talking about things, is we're getting a feel for each. I turned on each book of scripture. And so when we get to numbers, we're looking at content stuff and what's in numbers, what's not in numbers. Numbers is not a book that gets talked about a lot. And so looking at question 1 there, things that are in the book of Numbers. Is the golden calf in the book of Numbers? No, it's not. Where is that? Exodus. How about crossing the Jordan? Is that in the book of Numbers? Not quite. That's right. They're about ready to do that when Numbers finishes. They're right there on one side of the Jordan and they haven't crossed over yet. C, 12 spies are sent to examine the promised land.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a big part of the book of Numbers. Kind of cuts the book in half. And is a crux point or a pivot point in the book. D, 10 Commandments. Is that in the book of Numbers? No. Where do we find the 10 Commandments? There are 2 books we find the 10 Commandments in.
Exodus and Deuteronomy.
Yeah, Exodus and Deuteronomy. So Exodus is initial giving of some of the law, and then Deuteronomy gives the law to the second generation who haven't died in the wilderness and who are about to go on into the promised land. That's so Moses repeats that in Deuteronomy. Okay, E, counting the troops. Is that in Numbers?
Yes.
Yeah, hence the name of the book. That's why Numbers is called Numbers, because they're counting the troops. What's that? Twice, yes. F, arrangement of the Israelite traveling camp. I gave you a big clue on this week's quiz.
Yes.
Yeah. So they arranged the camp there, and then G, Balaam and his donkey.
Still.
Okay, Bob got that even with the picture, even without the picture being there. Yeah. So the story of Balaam's in the book of Numbers also. All right, 2, the difference between the first census and the second census in Numbers is, which one of those is true? D, yeah, and let's see. Alicia, can you read D for us?
The first counted the men of military age of the first generation. The second, the men of military age of the second generation.
Yeah, so Numbers has these 2 counts of the fighting men. Before they go into the promised land. And the first count's at the beginning of Numbers, and so all the troops are counted. And then they don't make it to the promised land. They die in the wilderness by the time the 40 years of wandering is over. And so there's a second count that occurs, felt like Sesame Street there for a second count. But second count that occurs in Numbers 26, and that's counting the second generation troops there. Okay, number 3, Numbers covers the period of time. Which one of those is true?
Between Sinai and the Jordan River.
Yeah, between Sinai and the Jordan River, so B. So this is the book where we have the history of the wilderness wanderings. And not everything is accounted for in this history. And toward the end of Numbers, you've got, now here's where we went, and you see they went all these different places that aren't, narrated through the book, but it's there. But this is the place where we see the narrative of what happens between Mount Sinai, where they get to the 10 Commandments and build the tabernacle, and then when they're on the edge of the Jordan River, ready to go into the Promised Land. And then number 4. Circle any or all who rebel against Moses in Numbers. Does Miriam rebel against Moses?
Yes.
She does. Who's she?
Moses' sister.
Moses' sister, yeah. How about Aaron? Does he rebel against Moses?
Yes.
Yeah, he does. And who is he related to Moses?
Moses' brother.
Moses' brother. And then Korah. Does Korah rebel against Moses?
Yes.
Yeah, right in the middle of the book in chapter 16, big rebellion against Moses. How about Dathan?
Yes.
Yeah, he's along with Korah. That's the same rebellion in Numbers 16. What happens to them, by the way? What happens to Korah and his...
They get swallowed up.
Yeah, swallowed up by the earth. God tells Moses, have Korah and his family get all together in a group with all their possessions, and everyone else get away. And God caused the earth to open up, and they're swallowed into the earth, and then the earth closes up over them. And then Joshua, does he rebel against Moses in the promised land?
No.
He does not. But his friends there in F, 10 of the 12 spies who were sent, sorry, I didn't correct that this week either, sent to examine the promised land. Yeah, Laura's shaking her head. Is Laura right?
Yes.
Laura is right. Yeah, so 10 of the 12 spies rebel against Moses. Moses says, we're going into the promised land. God has promised this for us. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. God will deliver it into our hand. And these 10 spies say Moses is wrong, and we shouldn't do what Moses says. And they lead the people against what Moses has told the people to do, which is from the Lord. Okay, and then fifth, the new one here. We looked at this just briefly last week. So this is the a little bit of review for you from last week. We can outline numbers real simply, just 3 points. And it's always nice when you can outline a book just simply and have it not be too complicated. So the first outline point, 1-1, constituting the what generation army? What could we put there? Yeah, this is the first generation army. So meaning the first generation to come out of the promised land, out of Egypt. And so those who were above 20 and above, are counted in this first census. And that's what's going on when Numbers starts. Second section begins in chapter 10, verse 11, if we want to be exact. Blank in the march to the promised land.
I've got 2 guesses.
Okay, a couple of what are some guesses you have for this section?
Arrangement or formation?
Okay, formation's a guess. That actually occurs in the first section. It does occur in Numbers, but it's in the first section.
Failures.
Yeah, failures. Failures in the march to the promised land. So the middle section is all about how the first generation, the adults, the full-blown adults who come out of Egypt, how they fail over and over and over again in their march to the promised land. So that covers the middle part of the book. And then our last outline point, chapter 26, began in verse 1. So those are your points, 1, 10, and 26. 26, what can we put here? We've got constituting the blank generation army. You are good test takers. There we go. Yeah, constituting the second generation army. And so all the folks who were 20 and above coming out of Egypt, who were counted in the first census, they're now dead. They've perished in the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Now Moses counts with the help of leaders of the tribes, counts the new army, second generation army. Okay, well, let me get us to our slide here. So here, just a reminder from last week. Can you see that okay?
It's a little, it could be more contrasting.
Okay, we'll get that. We'll get that set. But here's a map. So on the left-hand side here, so this is Promised Land over here. This is the Mediterranean Sea, which continues on down off of the slide. But Promised Land is in between the Dead Sea here, and then dumping into the Dead Sea from the north is the Jordan River, hence the Jordan Valley. Okay, and so mountainous area dumps water down into the Jordan River. and fills in the Dead Sea. Up at the very top of the Jordan River is, what body of water does the Jordan River come out of?
Sea of Galilee?
Yeah, the Sea of Galilee. So that's all in a line as you think about biblical geography here. You got the Sea of Galilee dumps into the Jordan River, which then eventually flows into the Dead Sea. Jerusalem's about here. It's not on the coast of the Dead Sea. It's up here, but it's fairly close, about there. So down Dead Sea area. John the Baptist kind of preached over here. He was just across the border of the Jordan River. So there we go. Jericho's here. So you see they cross the Jordan and they faced Jericho first. But here they are now. And this is where Moses writes the book of Numbers from. They're in the land of Moab. They've conquered a Moabite king. And Mount Nebo, they're surrounding here in these plains that surround the mountain. Moses goes up to Mount Nebo, looks over at the promised land because he's not allowed to go in, but God says, go up and take a look. And then after he takes a look, what's he do up there?
Die.
Yeah, he dies. Yeah. So Moses dies up on Mount Nebo. Okay. So we see this a number of times in Numbers, this phrase from Numbers 36. These are the commands and regulations the Lord gave through Moses to the Israelites on the plains of Moab here, across, by the Jordan across from Jericho. So they're here, they're getting ready to go over, and Moses writes the book of Numbers for them. Any questions about that? Okay. So yeah, there's Moab. There's Jericho. Okay, purpose of Numbers. I think we took a look at this slide last week. Anyone recall why Moses? And if you don't, that's okay. That's what we'll talk about today. Why would Moses be writing this book to these people who are about to cross into the promised land?
To show what the first generation did wrong.
Yeah, so that back to that middle section. Middle section is, first section shows everything's going great. Everything's organized. They got, all the troops ready. They're arranged in their camp, ready to go take the promised land. And then you get to that middle section, and the people, they're that first generation, continues time after time to be unfaithful. And then the book of Numbers is written as a display of here's where you could have been growing up in, but here's why you didn't grow up in the promised land. And so don't make the same mistakes as your fathers made. And here they are. And so Moses writes the book of Numbers to display to the second generation what the first generation did and why the first generation died in the wilderness instead of just making it into the promised land. So the writer of Hebrews talks about this. He says to Jewish Christians who are in the church in the first century, in the 60s, AD 60s, about 67, he says to them, don't be like your forefathers who got rescued from Egypt but didn't make it into the promised land. And so he tells Jews, the writer of Hebrews in the first century, he tells them, don't come out of Judaism, but then abandon your faith. Continue in your faith. Prove that your faith is real. Prove that it's saving faith and not just a profession of faith that's false. But actually believe that God has not only rescued you from Judaism, not that that was a bad thing, but he's also going to bring you into the promised land of heaven. And he reasons with the people reading the book of Hebrews, he reasons with them, you too can be like that first generation who through your lack of faith don't make it to heaven. So in other words, just because you've come into the church, that's not a one-to-one relationship with going to heaven. Because some people are in the church, like just think of today. Some people are in the church who don't have what? Saving faith in Jesus. And so the writer of Hebrews pleads with his Jewish brothers who are now in the church, don't be like this wilderness generation who died in the wilderness. They came out from what they were in, Egypt, but because they didn't have faith, they were like the 10 spies and the whole of Israel, except for Joshua, Caleb, and Moses, who said, and Miriam and Aaron, who said, we shouldn't go into the promised land. So relevance for today. If we understand numbers, we can understand the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. So purpose in numbers. Moses, so here's our thing here, why Moses wrote this book. So there's Moses on the plains of Moab, writing this book there. That's what he really looks like, right? Let's see. Bo, can you read this for us? Moses uses
the history of God's people from Sinai to keep to the edge of the promised land to encourage and instruct the new generation so that they would be successful in their taking of the promised land under Joshua.
Okay. And so there's another thing you see there at the tail end. It transitions them in leadership. So Numbers accounts for them and reminds them that God himself said to Moses, transition leadership over to Joshua, because you're going to die now, and Joshua's going to lead them into the promised land. But Moses writes the book of Numbers so that they won't just repeat history and do the same things their forefathers did. Because the walls of the cities in the promised land, as described in Deuteronomy, reached up to the sky. It's the same words describing the Tower of Babel in Genesis. And that's pretty intimidating, right? You don't want to. Anyone seen the series Vikings from the History Channel? Yeah, there are a couple times there's brutal fighting. Vikings fought with axes. That's brutal, right? But there are a couple times where you see them and they're attacking cities with walls, and they're just archers on the top of the cities. They're just picking them off from the top of the wall, and they're running up there and throwing stone. The people on the top of the wall are throwing stones at them. And these cities in the Promised Land, they have trained warriors, and the Israelites are just they're kids of former slaves. And so they were facing a lot of fear about going into the Promised Land, just like their fathers were. That's why their fathers had said no to going into the Promised Land, because what was the report about? The 12 spies come back and great fruit. Yeah, it is land flowing with milk and honey, but what do they say? Yeah, Joyce. The people are giant. Yeah.
We're like grasshoppers.
Yeah, we're like grasshoppers in their sight. So they're gonna step on us, and squash us, or like my friend Chet Hazelton in high school, he's gonna eat them. Chet was my crazy friend who played lacrosse because it was the craziest sport he could think of to play, and football too, and he loved being on special teams. But he would go out in he went out a few times in the courtroom at lunch, found a grasshopper, and then found as many people as he could find to watch him, and he ate it. But yeah, so lots of fear. So that's the kind of the felt need, so to speak, for the readers of the book of Numbers. So Moses writes this book for them to encourage them. Be strong. God will deliver this. Don't repeat 40 more years in the wilderness. God's ready to deliver you. Yeah. Any questions about this before we go on?
Did Joshua recognize the inherent difficulties that were in the Promised Land, or was he like just? Because if I recall, he doesn't contradict the other spies, but what he says is we have the power of God behind us, and that's how we'll overcome.
Yeah, so Joshua's fully aware of how big the walled cities are, the warriors being big, and they've seen the Amalekites, who were especially large nation of people. They were like Northern Europeans or whatever. It seems like Scandinavians I meet are all large. But yeah, so he was aware, but he said, but God has given this into our hands, is what he and Caleb say to the people. So we should take it.
And so the 10 of the 12 spies, their sin was not in lying, it was in a lack of faith.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. So it wasn't that. So all the spies see that the task was something they needed God for, but 10 of them said, we don't believe God will deliver us, or that he can, or maybe that he even really exists, or whatever their thoughts were. And so Joshua and Caleb are faithful because they see, yeah, it is difficult, but God's on our side and he'll deliver the land into our hands just like he promised. Okay. So here are the wilderness wanderings. We saw this before. They come out of Egypt. They cross the sea there. They're in Midian, which is Mount Sinai. Come across, and up there is Kadesh Barnea. I know that's small. You don't have to read that there, but here is, this is the spot where the 12 spies come back, and they give 10 of them give the bad report. And then God says to them, okay, you're going to wander in the wilderness until you're all dead. And those who are under 20, who I'm not going to hold responsible for this national decision because they were young and you didn't give them a vote, they're going to take the land. And then there's pseudo repentance there. And the people say, oh, we were wrong. We should go in and take the land anyway. But God says, I will not be with you, and I will not fight for you. Don't go in. And the people go in anyway, and that's what you see here. They go in anyway, and they get their tails whooped up here. Great losses, and so then they come back down. They come back down to Gulf of Aqaba here, Ezion Geber, this area. And they wander around all over, and lots of cities are named, and we don't know exactly where some of these cities were at the time. But then they eventually wind their way up. They go around to Edom, work their way through Moab and Ammon, and wind up in the plains of Moab up there on the top. Okay. And they do, one of the things that we do learn about is they head up to the plains of Moab, is that they try to avoid any kind of war there, but the kings come after them as they're headed up there. They ask through passage through Edom, which is like, well, here. Edom's their brothers. They're brothers. Who is Edom?
Jacob or Israel.
Yeah, Esau. And Esau was the brother of Jacob. Jacob is renamed Israel. God gives them that new name, Israel. And so the 12 tribes of Israel traveling around asked their brothers, the Edomites, can we cut through your land? And we're not going to take anything. We're not going to devastate your land. We don't want to go to war. And the Edomites are warlike against them. And so they go around the land. But then when they get up into Moab and the Ammon and Moab, or Moab and Ammon up there, kings come out to fight them. Og and Sihon come out, and since those nations come against Israel, Israel fights and God delivers them, and that's how we get some of the tribes of Israel living across here. So you got the half tribe of Manasseh is over here, and then you have Gad is over here as well as Reuben. So you have
kind of like
2.5 tribes that are trans-Jordan, or east of the Jordan River. And that happens because those two kings came out and fought against Israel, and Israel defeated them and scattered them. Yeah, Allison.
So that wasn't part of the original promised land. It's more of an annex.
Yes and no. So the promised land as described to Abraham in Genesis 15 goes from what it says, the river to the Wadi of Egypt. Now, the Wadi of Egypt, thank you, Anna. Anna taught me what a wadi was like 2 years ago, so now I know. But it's like down here. It's a low place, kind of where Egypt meets this Sinai Peninsula, kind of over here. And the Promised Land, so the Wadi of Egypt's here, and the river, whenever you see in the Old Testament, the river, usually capital R, it's the Euphrates River that's clear up by like Nineveh. Okay, and so, and this Promised Land gets realized during the days of Solomon, where they've just filled out all that land. But there's kind of a limited goal when they come out through Joshua, and that limited goal is to cross the Jordan and to just take. Sorry, I should be on my slide before, but I won't do it. But just to take that land to the west of the Jordan River, between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. That's kind of the Promised Land proper. But so yes and no. There's the 2.5 tribes that are east of the Jordan River, kind of an annex, but not really. They were supposed to, as God prospered them, to inhabit that whole area between that low point starting to go into Egypt and clear up to Assyria there. Okay. All right, content of Numbers. Okay, so big picture. What would you say our big picture is in Numbers? We mentioned it a little bit and talked about it a little bit last week.
Failure?
Okay, yeah, failure is kind of the big thing in Numbers. And when does the failure happen?
In the wilderness.
Yeah, in the wilderness. And so when you think Numbers, think wilderness wanderings and the failures that happen there. First, first section is they get set up for success with the first generation. And then the middle section is all their failures and why God sends them to wander for 40 years. And then the third section is where God sets up the second generation to head in with Joshua to the Promised Land. Okay. So let's read this here. Jeff, can you read this for us?
Big picture, Numbers is where we see the wilderness wanderings of Israel, covering what they're doing between Mount Sinai and crossing the Jordan.
Yeah, thank you. So Exodus happens in Egypt and then Mount Sinai. Genesis has happened like 400 years before that. Leviticus is that legislation, Leviticus, dealing with priests and Levites and holy living and all that stuff. That's a pretty static book. Not a lot of narrative there. It's just right there, a lot of legislation or regulations. So you don't see a narrative of any traveling really in Leviticus. Deuteronomy, Moses is just repeating the law for the second generation on the plains of Moab. But Numbers is where we have this accounting of what God's people were doing in between Sinai and Joshua taking them into the land. Okay, so that's the big picture. When you think of Numbers, think of wilderness wanderings and the failures that occurred there, and God setting them up again under Joshua to go in. Okay, so our outline, this is at the bottom of your page, 1:1. Emily, can you read that for us?
Constituting the first generation army.
Okay, and Teresa, second part.
10-11 failures in the march to the promised land.
Okay. And then Elijah, can you read our third bullet point there?
Constituting the second generation.
Okay, so second try. Try again. It's the end of the book of Numbers. Okay, so we're going to take a look now at constituting the first generation army. So here are some things that go on. Laura, can you read this for us? So first thing they do, and go ahead and open your Bibles or the Bible in your seat there. It's the book of Numbers, and we can see just keep this open from now till the end of our time here together in Sunday school, so you can get a feel for the book. And so Numbers 1:1 just starts out right with this. And probably in your Bible, you see it labeled there. What's it labeled, this section? The census. Is a census always evil?
No.
When do we see in the Bible it was evil?
During David's time.
Yeah, David's time. David was not, he takes a census of his fighting men because he had ceased for a time. He has a little hiccup of faith and he thinks, I'll be strong by the number of men I have instead of by looking to the Lord to deliver us. And so he had done that so well during all his life. And you see these battles where David prays to the Lord first and says, should I go in and attack them? And the Lord sometimes says, yes, go in. I've given them into your hand. Sometimes the Lord says, well, divide your troops and take some of them around this way. Or sometimes he says something like, wait until you hear I'll blow wind through the balsam trees. And when you hear that, then go in and attack. So David's been so good at this, but toward the end of his life, he has this little blip of unfaithfulness, and so it's a wicked census. But here you see verse 2. Joyce, can you read verse 2 for us? And this is the Lord speaking.
Take a census of the whole Israelite community by their clans and families, listing every man by name, one by one.
Yeah. So he comes in here and gives this command to have the census. So these men are counted, and you see these all the men 20 years. You can go down in chapter 1 there from the descendants of Reuben, chapter 20, 22, or verse 20, verse 22 to Simeon, then Gad, then Judah. And so it's all the men 20 years old or more who were able to serve in army were listed by name according to the records of their clans and family. Their number from, like, the tribe of Judah in verse 27, for instance, was 74,600. Okay, so all these tribes are lined up, and the fighting men, those 20 years old or more who were able to serve in the army. Yeah.
So a lot of numbers in the Bible are symbolic, like 40 days, 40.
Sure.
But they're literal, but also symbolic. And one of the criticisms of the Bible is that the Israelites couldn't possibly have had this many people.
Yeah.
But we, as our denomination, we take this as literal numbers, correct?
You can and you can't and still be faithful.
Okay.
And so here's what's going on with that. So you look at these numbers and they are very specific there. And then you get to the end and you see a total number. Look at chapter 2, verse 32. So find chapter 2, verse 32. These are the Israelites counted according to their families, all those in the camps by their divisions, number 603,550. And if you go through and count the summaries of the fighting men, they did good math there. One of the issues with this, some people raise, man, that's a lot of people, and that's just the fighting men. That's not even the wives and the kids that are listed there, or the people above 20 who were men who were not able to fight. They were injured or, had whatever. And so is that huge? And then when you get to Deuteronomy 7, God says, I chose you not because you were the largest of the nations. And that's a pretty big group. And so, the question come around, if they had this many, 603,000, why were they afraid to go after a city? Right? Like a walled city. Now, some of these cities were big. And so some people raise that up and wonder about these numbers. Now, here are a couple of things going on. In ancient languages, including Hebrew, numbers and animals are the hardest things to translate because you don't have lots of context. So, like sometimes when animals are mentioned, it says like the beaver, and then there's a footnote and it says, or it could be this. Because it's like, imagine just reading, like you get a guide to a zoo in China, You know, and there's just a list of all these things and no pictures. Now, if one of the names there, one of the animals in Chinese also says, you know, and you know Chinese, you just don't know animal names, says, this animal builds dams in waterways. Then you say, okay, this word means beavers. But you have a lot of words for animals that you don't have context. And there's just not enough where we know. And numbers the same thing. And so it's a little bit hard to translate numbers. On top of this, if you've seen, you know, Hebrew, so here's Hebrew. Everybody be very impressed. There's Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zion, Het, and Tet, Yod, Kaf. You can write that 3 ways. Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samach, Ayin, Pei. 3 ways to write that. Sade, Kof, or Resh. Sorry. I know you guys are sticklers on that. There we go. Sin, Shin, and Tav. Okay, so that's Hebrew. So look at all.
Looks like a beaver.
Yeah, there we go. So you can see there are all these little things like these lines, and even when Hebrew's being written, like with a brush, you know, these letters, you know, if you're looking at them in some nice print of Hebrew, it's like a that line and a that line and a that line. And so, and like, take a look at this. So here's Hey, and here's Het. The difference between these two is that this line is connected, and that line's not connected. Or you can look at, sorry, I'll do these. So down here, I'll do these better. So here's Sin, and here's Shin. Little dot. It's all separates them. Okay, and so like here's, you know, some other things that are very similar. You can go down here. Okay, so this is noon, which is an N. Okay, and that's how you write when it's in the middle of a word. Here's how you write when it's the last letter of a word. You extend it. So all these, you know, these extended ones, like here, that's all when you're at the end of a word. Like, where's the peg? Yeah, there it is. Yeah, there you go. And when you extend this noon, looks like this. Well, that looks pretty close to the Vav, which is over here. So imagine you're copying Hebrew scriptures. And so there are a few little things here when you're dealing with numbers. And the word for thousands, when you write it, is like a tiny stroke of the pen, different from divisions. And that's a tiny stroke of the pen different from chiefs. And so when you look at the numbers here, you know, it says that let's just take a 131 there up in Zebulun with the UN there. You know, that 131, the number from the tribe of Zebulun was 57. Okay, now there's the word we represent by a comma. 57,000. But that could possibly be 57 chiefs and 400 men. So there were 57 chiefs and altogether, other than those 57, were 400 men. Or if it's a different stroke of a pen there, it's, you know, 57 divisions, which consisted of 400 men there. And so if you do that, if you say, you know, that possibly we're looking at this wrong, and this written by a human being and not by typeset, was the word for chiefs, not the word for thousands. And so that's why evangelical Bible believing people are free to pick on this. It's just because we don't know Hebrew well enough, or don't have the manuscript that Moses himself wrote to examine it under a microscope to see which is which. So that's a long answer for that. So it could have been, these are the exact numbers, or it could be that these were all, before that comma is how many chiefs or how many divisions, and after the comma is how many fighting men were in those divisions. The advantage of saying it's just the number of men, there were 57,320, it's simpler. The disadvantage is it gives Israel a huge army that shouldn't be afraid of going into the promised land, except for no one wants to go to war, right? So that's still reasonable. So both of those are still reasonable for us. Okay, so that's counting the fighting men. Was a major thing that goes on here. And then, second thing that they do is, Randy, can you read this for us?
Arranging the camp for the theocentric.
Yeah, that's so they arrange the camp theocentrically. And so here's the theocentric arrangement of the camp. You've also got it on your sheet there, your quiz. And so God always, just has a purpose for everything. And he's showing his people that he's the center. He is the center of Israel. They're not the center. He's the center. And beyond this, how does he show that he's the center? Anyone close enough to read this word?
Tabernacle.
He puts the tabernacle in the center. So look at this theocentric arrangement. He's got the tabernacle in the center. And then the entrance of the tabernacle, it looks like the entrance is over here, but that's just blotted out because of these words. The entrance was over here. And he puts in front of the entrance Moses and the priests, guardians of the entrance. And then around the other sides of the tabernacle, the 3 tribes of Levites. So Levi had 3 sons. He had Merari and Gershon and Kohath. Okay, and so the Merarites, the Gershonites, and the Kohathites, Merarites are all in the north, Gershonites in the west, and Kohathites on the south. And so the tabernacle is completely surrounded and guarded. Again, as we've talked about just a little bit before, the tabernacle in ancient cultures, as they traveled around in war, the king took a portable palace with him. And the portable palace was made of canvas and poles and rings and all the stuff we see the tabernacle made of. And it had a throne room in there. And so God communicates to his people, I am your king, traveling with you in my palace. And I have my guards around here. The tribe, Levi, who's dedicated to my service. The priests are closest to the entrance because they're the ones that can deal with all the sacrifices and that kind of thing. But the Levites who assist priests are around the tabernacle as well. So that's right in the center of the camp. Then the southern camp, you've got Gad, Simeon, and Reuben. Eastern camp, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Northern camp, you got Naphtali, Asher, and Dan. And then on the west side, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin there. But they surround this tabernacle, and they're reminded each morning when they wake up and each evening when they sleep that God is the center of our identity. The God who delivered us from Egypt, that gave us instructions about building this tabernacle for the worship of him. This is the center of who we are as a people. We are centered around God, and our worship of him is the main thing we do. And so God instructs that in chapter 2. You see the chapter 2 references there. So that's something they've got in their minds all the time, that God is with us in the tabernacle, and we're surrounded by that reality. Okay. Next thing, we get to failures in the march. So that you've got 12 spies, and they come back and abundant fruit, and they gave a good report about the land itself. They're like, this is a good land, flowing with milk and honey, and look at some of this produce. We brought examples back for you. But what do they do when they report? They say what? 10 of them say,
But there's no way we can beat these people.
no way we can beat these people.
These walled cities.
Yeah, walled cities. The people rebel and say, we're not going in. Moses brought us out here to kill us. Yeah, Bill.
We do the same today, the way they exaggerated.
Yeah,
Walls up to the sky, what, were the walls thousands of feet high?
Right.
No, they weren't.
yeah,
Were they really as small as a grasshopper compared to a human being? No, they weren't.
right.
But we tend to exaggerate when we want things to go our way.
Yeah, good point. Yep. And so that's who we are. When we want our way, we stretch the truth or we exaggerate. You have in this section the rebellions, many rebellions against Moses, including his own brother and sister, Miriam and Aaron. That's like chapter 12. I believe that's 12. 16 is Korah and his rebellion. Korah was one of the Levites, and he leads a rebellion that includes some of the tribe of Gad against Moses, and he's swallowed up. You got the 12 spies that occurs in chapters 13 and 14, and the bad report that they give. And so Moses intercedes for them. And so God doesn't wipe them out completely, but God does pronounce sentence on them that they're not going to go to the promised land. Ever in 20 and over, not getting in. Except for whom? Joshua and Caleb, the two with faith, who have declared, we should go in and take this land. Yes, fortresses. Yes, giant men, but God will give it into our hands. And so they go forward in.
The more I study these books,
Yeah,
the more I feel bad for Moses, because if they had gone in the first place, he would have been able to go in.
yeah,
But it was during the wanderings that he was
yeah.
not allowed.
Yeah, that's right. Finally, Moses, is so frustrated because he's been rebelled at all these times. He didn't want leadership in the first place. Remember Exodus 3 in the burning bush? Send someone else. And God finally says, you shut your mouth. I'm sending you. Okay, I'll give you Aaron, but you're the guy. And so Moses didn't want this. And finally, he gets so frustrated. Instead of just raising his staff over the rock, he strikes the rock to get water out of it. And God says, no, when you're in my service, you need to do exactly as I say. And so Moses should have done exactly as the Lord said, but the people were at fault. They were the cause of him getting angry. He finally blew his top. And so he doesn't make it into the promised land because of the rebellion of the people. And so that's about chapter 20 that we see that. Okay, so 26, we have the constituting of the second army. And so chapter 26, yeah, Jim.
I was just wondering, at the time the 12 spies went into the promised land,
Yeah.
what was the relative strength of Egypt versus the armies in the promised land? Wasn't Egypt like a bigger power and
Yeah.
army? So the Israelites had seen God already defeat.
Yeah. So they have even less excuse. Yeah, that's right. So there's a new army count in chapter 26. Again, talk of the tabernacle centrality, chapters 28 through 30. So talk of sacrifices, feasts, more talk of vows in chapter 30. We had seen talk of vows in Leviticus 27 at the end of Leviticus. And then promised land inheritance matters, how they're going to divide up the land, what happens if a man from a certain tribe only has daughters. Can't imagine what that's like. Does he lose his land because land was passed down to the oldest son? And God says, no, it's not. The daughters take over the land, but they have to marry within their tribe so that one tribe doesn't lose land to another tribe, because those boundaries are set. And so you have all that in the 32 through 36 about how you're going to divide the promised land, a bigger land for more people, but ultimately it's divided by lot, so that there won't be jealousy between the people. You know, they won't say, well, you got that better land over there because you tricked us. It was done by lot, so that people could say, well, that was the hand of the Lord, and that's what Numbers says there, that God determines. Yeah.
So that's where we got the name Lot, you know, for.
I don't know if there is a Hebrew connection between those like there is in English. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, so God has them divide the land by lot, so that there won't be jealousy among the tribes as to which land they got. You got better land than we did, and because the Lord specifically says, do it by lot, so you'll know it's the hand of the Lord that did this and not the will of man. So that's that. So that's Numbers. Okay. So next week we'll take on the book of Deuteronomy. Any quick questions as we close? All right. Well, let's pray.